Hi, my name is JP Castlin and welcome to this isolated talk. Today I thought that we would talk about strategy because it's kind of my thing. And just to show why it's kind of my thing, I thought that I would just very briefly introduce myself for those of you who don't know me. So in my normal day job, I am the CEO of an international strategic consultancy called Rouser. I tend to work primarily on global strategic matters. But I also give talks on the topic, or at least I used to. The current pandemic has very much thrown a monkey wrench into that. But I traveled around the world and I give talks on strategy, basically. I also write a fair bit on the topic. So in the past, I've written for outlets such as The Drum and the IPA's F-Works, or Effectiveness Works, which you may know from Gentleman, Les Binet, and Peter Field. And then for the last year or so, I have been a columnist for Marketing Week. And then I do something called the Rouser Manifesto. And it originally started a fair few years back when me and a then colleague named Gary Rivers decided to put our thoughts on strategy into writing. It wasn't meant as a content marketing piece, anything like that. It was literally just a gathering of thoughts. And over the years, we have updated this annually, and it has become, I'm very proud to say, quite popular. So for isolated talks, I thought that I would read for the first time ever, the first chapter of the 2020 Rouser Manifesto, which will be, I hope, bigger and better than ever. Now, I should point out as well is that for this year, we are doing the manifesto completely free. We're making it completely free, which basically means that if this whets your appetite, floats your boat, then just reach out to us and we'll send you a free copy of the 2020 manifesto. All you need to do is send us your email address. It's at hello@rouser.se. So it's hello@rouser.se. And I should point out that we will not use your email for anything else. We will not save it once we've sent you the manifesto. It's literally only for an Excel file so that we can get all the people in who want the manifesto and send it to them. And before I get into actually reading the first chapter, I thought that I would talk a bit about the theme of this year's manifesto, and it is theory versus practice. And unfortunately, in order to be able to sort of unearth what practical exceptions may exist, we have to first understand the underlying theory. And the first chapter is kind of intended to do that. It builds up and sets up the rest of the manifesto. So for the marketing-oriented, well, I suppose viewer, this may come across as perhaps a bit dense, a bit business strategically oriented, but stay with me. It sets the rest of the document up, and also the same principles apply to marketing strategy as any other kind of strategy. So they are as important to understand and know for a marketing manager as any other business manager. So, with that in mind, let's now, for the first time ever exclusive for isolated talks, read the first chapter of the 2020 Rouser Manifesto. Chapter 1. Putting things into perspective. There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy. William Shakespeare, Hamlet. What does his lucid explanation amount to but this? That in theory, there is no difference between theory and practice, while in practice, there is. Benjamin Brewster, the Yale Literary Magazine. Strategy first. In the original Rouser Manifesto, the opening chapter was rather fittingly, or at least so we imagined at the time, titled Strategy First. It seemed apparent to the point of being a given. An action plan must, per definition, come before the action is taken. However, the question of whether strategy in all cases does, or indeed should, come first is not as crystal clear as one might initially be led to believe. Though it is very much a theoretic and therefore standard rule, there are practical circumstances that doubtlessly may warrant an exception. For the traditionally trained strategists, this may come as a surprise. After all, we are taught that strategy is the proactive roadmap for any organization, brand, or campaign. With that one in place, things have a tendency to become reactive and tactical. this remains of course largely true. Nevertheless, there are things that demonstrably work in modern practice, even if they do not necessarily hold up well in classical theory. And if something does deliver a desired result, it becomes irrelevant whether it is supposed to. Yet, while knowing the exceptions to the rules may enable you to master the game, such insights can only come out of prior understanding of the rules themselves. Ergo, in order to unearth what practical exceptions may exist to traditional strategic discourse or doctrine, it is necessary to first define the lay of the land. Without a thorough grasp not merely of what strategy is, but what it is supposed to do, one risks losing sight of the bigger picture and instead zooming in on minutiae that may or may not be of much use to the business. Outlining strategy. Many a prominent business thinker and, well, rank amateur alike have tried to define either directly or indirectly what strategy is. As a result, as Henry Mintzberg points out in The Rise and Fall of Strategic Planning, the word is used in a myriad of different ways. Most commonly, a strategy is considered a plan, a how, a means of getting from here to there. B, a pattern in actions over time. C, a position that reflects decisions to offer particular products or services in particular markets. Or D, a perspective, i.e. a vision and direction. Now notably, as the attentive reader, or I suppose in this case viewer, will realize, these uses are different almost to the point of being each other's counterparts. A plan is the result of direct control and deliberateness, whereas a revealed pattern is the outcome of indirect control and emergence. Similarly, a position is where one is, while a direction is indicative of where one wants to be, and therefore, per definition, is not. These tensions, to use the term coined by Bob DeWitt in Strategy Synthesis, mean that things are looking bleak for anyone searching for simplicity, certainty, or the style of binary advice likely to stem from so-called experts who would prefer to paint the world in monochrome. The sprawling and splendid diversity of practical circumstance blatantly renders universal matrices, flow diagrams, and one-size-fits-all solutions moot. Consequently, in the interest of intellectual honesty and integrity, this manifesto will contain none. Having said that, as much as one should combat oversimplification or reductionism, one must also, to paraphrase Christopher Hitchens in Letters to a Young Contrarian, be aware of how often complexity is used as a means of obfuscation. Irrelevant complexities are habitually inserted to challenge principles, and there are clearly principles in strategy that at least will allow practitioners to weigh different approaches against one another, given key contextual factors. It is worth emphasizing that though they may initially come across as rather business strategically derived for the marketing-oriented reader, or I suppose, again, viewer, the principles do apply to strategy in general. As such, they are as important for marketing managers as any other business managers to know, as will become clear in subsequent chapters. So, with that throat clearing over and done with, let's outline strategy and remind ourselves of the fundamentals. So, admittedly, broadly speaking, there are two main approaches to strategy: deliberate strategy and emergent strategy. And they all each sit on opposite ends of a strategic spectrum. Deliberate strategy. So deliberate strategy is the top-bottom approach with which most strategists will be familiar, albeit the term itself may not be. It puts the strategies firmly in the realm of classic strategic planning, where one carefully considers what to do and then does it. As an intended course of action, the inherently aspirational strategic plan will detail how to get from a present point A to a sought-after point B, and thereby include both ends and means. In essence, it sets a clear and relatively long-term direction, creates commitment to that direction, and manages alignment along the way, at least through programming, viz. Activities planned in advance. Such strategic arrangement, or rudimentary versions thereof, has long been one of the cornerstones of business in general and management in particular. Henri Fayol's Administration industrielle et générale established 5 primary functions of management: planning, organizing, commanding, coordinating, and controlling. And they did so more than 100 years ago. Peter Drucker further polished the approach by introducing management by objectives, or MBOs, in his seminal piece, The Practice of Management, which became the height of corporate fashion in the late 1950s. The first book explicitly on business strategy was published a couple of years later, Alfred D. Chandler Jr.'s Strategy and Structure, Chapters in the History of the American Industrial Enterprise, which came out in 1962. Over 20,000 books on strategy in English alone have been published since. By some distance, the majority deal with deliberate strategy in one form or another. However, while much of what is commonly put forward is possible in theory, it's crucial to recognize that no strategy will be purely deliberate in practice. And this is because inherently, deliberate strategy makes a series of presumptions that inevitably fail to hold up against reality. Henry Mintzberg and James Waters have consistently highlighted these issues, or this weakness, at least of strategies deliberate and emergent. In their view, 3 conditions that rarely, if ever, exist at the same time would have to be met for deliberate strategies to be flawlessly realized. Firstly, there must exist precise intentions in the organization, articulated in such a concrete level of detail that no doubt would exist about what to do. Secondly, these intentions must be common to all relevant actors, either shared as if their own or wholly accepted from management. Thirdly, these collective intentions must be realized exactly as intended, which would presume zero, e.g. competitor or market, interference. That is to say, the environment must have been either perfectly predictable, totally benign, or under the full control of the organization. None of this is, of course, very likely. On top of that, the strategy itself may be subpar and thus effectively stillborn. For one, successful deliberate strategy presupposes a thorough understanding of the problem to be solved. Despite an abundance of data in modern business, this is yet another presumption that has proven rather wobbly indeed. There's also the ignorance factor. An unspoken truth about business is that many companies make it not because of their competencies, but despite their incompetencies. Strategists are, unfortunately, not exempt. Emergent strategy. So, strategic plans are regularly diverted from or completely ignored, be it out of necessity, incomprehension, or ignorance. A set of actions instead emanate as the organization learns what works in practice. Practitioners will know this only too well. Theorists need but to look at their own analyses. More likely than not, they will describe consistency in past behavior, a pattern in action over time. This should not come as a surprise. If strategies can be planned and intended, it follows that they can also be pursued and realized, or not realized as the case may be. A strategy realized as intended will be, per definition, deliberate. If it is realized despite, or in the absence of, intention, it is considered emergent. Undoubtedly, business journalists, columnists, and, second-rate analysts will nonetheless attribute actions taken to a deliberate strategy. Such as humanity, we tend to judge ourselves based on our intentions and everyone else based on their behavior. But one must only for a second consider all the complexity and confusion underlying such an assumption to realize that it is utter folly. Clearly, not all intended strategies are realized, and not all realized strategies were intended. Strategies can form as well as be formulated. They can emerge, as it were. So emergent strategy is a bottom-top approach, likely to be a novel concept to many. In a study conducted specifically for the purposes of this manifesto, more than 3/4 of 200 plus marketing respondents were completely unaware of the term. Now, unlike deliberate strategy, which plots a specific course, emergent strategy discovers the path along the way, arising in response to unexpected opportunities and challenges as the competitive reality in which the company acts changes over time. Or, to put it more colloquially, the strategist adapts to what is found to work in practice, unintended consequences and all, by creating a strategy in response to it, instead of stubbornly staying with what ought to have worked based on theory or forecasts. Though projections may not be so poor as to only serve as to make astrology look respectable, as Ezra Solomon once famously put it, they are by obvious necessity built on historical data. Consequently, they tend to assume that the future will bear a strong resemblance to the past, something that may or may not turn out to be true. Emergent strategy solves that problem. Alas, one cannot simply pivot to emergence either. The reasons again are plenty. For one, different decisions carry different feedback loops, some of which are so long that they render emergent strategy practically useless. There's also the matter of risk. To bastardize a couple of lines from Mark Spitznagel, originally about Nietzschean investment approaches, the expected return of a strategic effort is a highly subjective probability weight average of all possible what-if paths during a given time period. Risk is a similar weighing of bad paths. While one might think that emergent strategy would be better suited to handle risk, the longer the perspective, the larger the uncertainty, at least on a micro level, it's not entirely true. Trial and error cannot, as Nicholas Taleb has noted, be unconditionally effective. Errors cause planes to crash, buildings to collapse, and knowledge to regress. This adds a crucial second dimension to strategizing that many may fail to recognize. In certain environments, it may be essential to not merely consider the likelihood of an outcome, but also the potential cost of an error. In other words, as much as deliberate strategy may fail to materialize in practical reality, it can nonetheless be a practical necessity. Likewise, if an organization or marketing department lacks a sense of direction, its future may end up entirely controlled by external factors and events, resulting in a future neither planned for nor wanted. Hence, in practice, strategy requires both foresight and insight, and can as impossibly be fully emergent as it could ever be wholly deliberate. It should instead be a contextually determined balance of optionality and obligation between the two, and weighing them against one another, which we'll discuss in the next chapter, is the actual reason why strategy is sacrifice. So, in summary, whether something holds up in theory is irrelevant if it works in practice. Strategy can, broadly speaking, be divided into two approaches that each sit on the end of a strategic spectrum: deliberate strategy and emergent strategy. Deliberate strategy, top-bottom, relies on strategic planning and foresight. While it can create direction and commitment, the future is difficult to predict even with models. It also presupposes that all stakeholders understand what it entails. Emergent strategy, bottom-top, is about patterns that arise despite or in the absence of intention, consistency in action actually taken. It allows for opportunism and agility, but can fail to account for prolonged feedback loops, certain managerial requirements, and some types of risk. So practical strategy will be neither 100% deliberate nor 100% emergent, but a contextually defined balance between the two. And so concludes the first chapter of the 2020 Rouser Manifesto. In subsequent chapters, we break down what this all means for global strategy versus regional strategy, how it affects startups versus incumbents, i.e. big brands, and how you can work with it as a marketer on a practical daily basis. Again, the entire purpose of this manifesto is to break down theory and practice. We have just gone through the theory. Now it's time to look at the practice. And if you want that, again, just send us an email at hello@rouser.se and we will send you the manifesto for free. Until then, above all, stay safe. And remember, as I'm sure about a gazillion different brands have told you by now, we're all in this together, quite literally. Have a good one. My name is JP Castlin. Stay safe.